Our first speaker this afternoon is Professor Frank Barry from Trinity College, who is an economist rather than a historian, but he's, I suppose, an economic historian, and he is going to speak to us about the economic policies of Sinn Féin and the First Dáil and the various elements there. So without further ado, I'll call on Frank. Thank you.
Thank you. So I didn't fully decide what I was going to talk about until I'd heard this morning's presentations, and then I said I'd kind of extemporise based on topics that came up. But largely I find, most of what I wanted to say has not actually been covered, so that's good. We did hear from last speaker, Brian, though, that, and as Princess Diana famously said, though she wasn't talking about the 1918 general election, there were three parties to the relationship. So the parties I'm referring to, obviously, Parliamentary Party, Sinn Féin, and the Unionists. And I'm only going to be talking about Southern Ireland now. So the Southern Unionists and the Northern Unionists had really split from each other, not formally yet, but were essentially following different agendas. I'm primarily going to talk about economic background and context, and I've very little to say about the election itself, but the debates between Home Rule and Unionism had really been raging since the 1890s. So there's several decades of pamphlets available where people set out their agenda and their beliefs and so on. But again, as John Bruton said this morning, there are obviously parallels with Brexit, and I'm going to kind of milk them to the full in the first few minutes. So let's think of the Unionists of the time as the Remainers. And then the Parliamentary Party as maybe the soft exiteers, and the Sinn Féin as the hard exiteers. And I want to see what other parallels. Now, there's lots of minor parallels. So, as you know, at the time of the treaty and afterwards was debates about the jurisdiction of a supranational court, which at the time was the Privy Council and so on. But that's a little tenuous. But there are much more significant parallels. One that's very interesting, to me at least, hopefully to you as well, is the difference in interpretation of what the economic consequences of the Act of Union had been. And think now, in Britain there are people who interpret, the economic consequences of EU membership differently from each other. So this is a clear divide between nationalists and unionists. But almost more important was the expectations of what Home Rule or secession might actually mean economically. And here there was a huge difference between nationalists on the one side and unionists on the other. And in fact, other than in terms of the politics, the political aspects of Home Rule versus independence, on economic policy there wasn't much difference between the Parliamentary Party and Sinn Féin. I'll try and tease out some of the differences later on, but we heard the 1918 election manifestos earlier on referred to. There was almost nothing about economics in there. It's hard to imagine an election manifesto now. It's hard to imagine an election being fought on anything other than economics, really, these days. But this was one clear difference then, interpretations of what the consequences of union had been, and more importantly, expectations of what the future would bring. Now, the more I read, and I come from a nationalist background, but the more I read the economic debates, the more I'm convinced, to use another phrase that's very current, Jean-Claude Juncker's, magical thinking, the magical thinking of the nationalists, of both sides of nationalists. They assumed, they equated independence with prosperity. And, that was going to be a big shock to us in coming decades. So I think magical thinking is a wonderful phrase. And as I was thinking about this, I realised, I love Yeats's poetry, and there's a very short Yeats poem that where I think the kind of Protestant scepticism over this magical thinking comes out. It's a 2-line poem. Parnell came down the road, he said to a cheering man, Ireland should get her freedom and you still break stone. I think I learnt that at school. And it's kind of magical, but I think it encapsulates the scepticism over this magical thinking of unionists. Another parallel is the way the Remainers looked with disdain on the Leavers. And we see that again, the Remainers in the UK today being seen as the cosmopolitan elite. There's a recent book written on the political divide in Britain that says the Leavers are from somewhere, meaning they're rooted in where they come from, and the Remainers are from anywhere. They're kind of this cosmopolitan elite. And I think that kind of thinking permeates through the debates between the differences between unionism and nationalism as well. It was expressed obviously in more colourful and more vitriolic language at the time, but there was this sense on the part of Remainers, the unionists, that the nationalists were provincial. So I have one quote that the great houses were described by one Remainer of the time as oases of culture, of uprightness and of fair dealing in what will otherwise be a desert of dead uniformity, where lofty ideals, whether of social or imperial interest, will be smothered in an atmosphere of superstition, greed and chicanery. Now, a lot of the language at that time strikes me certainly anyway as quasi-racist, so you would have, the tone would be more moderate these days, but nevertheless I think the feeling may be one can identify, with similar passions being expressed these days. And one final parallel that I want to mention is there's a lot of talk these days about the echo chamber, the social media echo chamber, whereby one side only talks with people of the same point of view, and similar for the other side. It's talked about a lot with respect to Trump's America these days, but it's also talked about with respect to Brexit. And when you look back on 100 years ago or so in Ireland, the communications gap between the two sides was far wider even than the social media echo chamber of today. There's a wonderful little book called Crowned Harp by Nora Robertson, an ascendancy lady. It was published in 1960, and she says that Southern Unionists were led by those who had, and I quote, never in their lives mixed with educated nationalists. And from another book, one Southern Unionist reported, upon meeting parliamentary party moderates at the Irish Convention for the first time, we liked them a great deal better than we had expected. And you find I'm particularly interested in the business elite of the period, and in Southern Ireland at least, Protestant and nationalist businessmen interacted with each other in this chambers of commerce, which is why you have historians like Louis Cullen writing about the Dublin Chamber of Commerce and so on. They interacted with each other, but they led almost completely separate social lives. So there was a huge communication gap between the two. Now, that doesn't obviously explain the difference in political perspectives or in understanding of history and expectations of the future, but they are, I think, interesting parallels. So the 1918 general election, as I've said, had almost nothing to do with economics. People had made up their minds at that time already. When one looks back now at the economic divide between unionists and nationalists, we often think it had to do with, at least, if one understands anything about the economics, we often had to think that it had to do with protectionism. So Arthur Griffith, founder of Sinn Féin, was, a very staunch protectionist, meaning you put up high tariff barriers, you inhibited international trade in order to create profit opportunities for domestic industries to arise. And this is why one might think nationalist control of fiscal policy and of customs and excise was so important. And this was an element. It's easy to understand Ulster's not being prepared to accept a nationalist government if it was going to be protectionist, because Ulster industry was integrated into the global economy. And protectionism, which would mean the erection of trade barriers, Ulster industry simply couldn't live with that. Neither, interestingly, could Southern Unionists live with it because of the dozen or so large Southern export businesses 11 of them, all but one, were owned by Southern Unionists. So they were as committed to free trade. Their economic interests were as tied into free trade, as was true of Ulster industry. But of course, the big industry in Southern Ireland was agriculture. And agriculture was export-oriented as well. And so, agriculture had no interest in protectionism either. So it's actually a bit of a mistake to think that the economics of independence versus unionism was about protectionism. It wasn't. That doesn't make sense. And, it's easy to understand why the Free State in the 1920s didn't turn protectionist. Agricultural interests were dominant, and, protectionism was simply not in their interest. And it wasn't necessarily the coming to power of Fianna Fáil in 1932 that changed everything. It was the Great Depression. The entire world turned protectionist with the Great Depression. Fianna Fáil would have had it very hard to promote its protectionist agenda after 1932 if the Great Depression weren't here. Agricultural interests were the dominant interests in Ireland at the time. So the main economic battle then between unionists and nationalists was not so much about protectionism but about home rule finance. And since the 1890s there had been dozens of pamphlets. There was a war of pamphlets on this issue. Could a home rule parliament, or even more so an independent parliament, be financially, could it live within its means? And if it couldn't, it would have to borrow on international markets. So this issue of home rule finance is hugely important. And so I'd referred to kind of magical thinking of nationalists before. I'll go on and talk about that a little bit further. But this notion of protectionism was something then of an urban intellectual's dream. Arthur Griffith's espouser of protection. It was an urban intellectual's fantasy. But we see it all over the other newly independent states of the post-First World War period. The 9 or 10 states that became independent on the eastern periphery of Europe at the end of the First World War, from Finland down to Yugoslavia, all that eastern border with the collapse of those empires, they all turned protectionist as well. And they turned much more substantially protectionist than Ireland did, but they weren't democratic the way Southern Ireland was, and therefore they could override the interests of the peasantry, as would have been referred to there. So Parliamentary Party and Sinn Féin were not so different on protectionism. They both kind of espoused it, but it's hard to believe that they really thought they could get it through in the face of dominant agricultural interests. So Arthur Griffith, everybody knows, so arch protectionist. In trying to interpret the economics of the Parliamentary Party, I read a lot of Tom Kettle. So Tom Kettle is the guy with the bust in Stephen's Green, responsible for 2 of the most wonderful lines of poetry in the English language, I think, which are there on the bust. But he had been a Parliamentary Party MP, and then he resigned to read economics when he was appointed to the first chair of political economy in UCD. Now, his economics is not really coherent to a modern economist, but he has one great line. He dismissed as imposters those who run around the country claiming that everybody can be made richer by putting a tax on the price of everything. That was a dig at Arthur Griffith, because protectionism is a tax. A tariff is a tax. And if you erect high protectionist barriers, it makes everything more expensive for everybody. So that was his dig at it. But nevertheless, he was ultimately protectionist. He just said, look, there'll be short-term pain, but there'll be long-term gain. What the nationalists did not do was explain where the long-term gain was coming from. Elaine, who spoke here this morning, was given a talk at Trinity recently, and I raised this point about this magical thinking of nationalism. And Ewan O'Halpin, who was in the chair, said, it sounds like Boris Johnson to me. And, and honestly, it's shocking to me, as from a nationalist background, to be saying something like that. But the levers in Ireland at that time were as magical in their thinking as the Brexiteers are today. Now, it's fine to believe in magical thinking, but nevertheless, that's an assessment. But But even Griffith's protectionism later became confused with the notion of self-sufficiency. And they're technically very different things. When Fianna Fáil came into power, it kind of had this confused notion of building up industry behind protectionist barriers. But Griffith's thinking is really what's called an infant industry argument. You protect your infant industries until they're strong enough to be able to grow up and walk on world markets themselves. And that became confused with the whole agricultural self-sufficiency agenda of trying to turn the country towards tillage and away from dairying and so on. But to return to this issue of home rule finance, since Daniel O'Connell, the big argument, a nationalist argument against the Union had been that Ireland was overtaxed under the Union. And a parliamentary committee, a Westminster Treasury Committee established at the time of the first Home Rule Bill, found sure enough that Ireland had been overtaxed. So that meant that if Home Rule were granted, then a financial settlement would be made whereby Ireland would be able to live within its means. In other words, account would have been taken for this historical overtaxation. Since that Treasury Committee in the 1890s, another one was established in 1913 to prepare for the Home Rule Bill of 1914, and that found things had changed. So Ireland had been overtaxed up until the 1890s, but since then the government expenditures on Ireland had become higher than Irish taxation. So now Ireland was undertaxed. What had changed was primarily the introduction of the old age pension in 1908. The old age pension was an incredible resource for Ireland. First of all, incomes in Ireland were half what they were in Britain, and yet the rate of pension was the same because it was a unified system. So Ireland was much poorer than Britain, and also it had an older population. So Ireland had a huge inflow of capital from the British government in the form of the old age pension. And everybody recognised this. This was the big issue in Home Rule finance. But again, the magical thinking of nationalists come out here that Tom Kettle, the Parliamentary Party economist, had said he recognised, okay, yes, certainly we're getting a big surplus from the payment of the pension from the UK Exchequer, but he said independence will bring such prosperity that we don't really need to worry about that. But they never explained where the prosperity was going to come from. Arthur Griffith, as you know, said there's no reason why the island of Ireland can't support a population of 15 million, which we're still a long way to achieving. So the pensions issue really came home to roost when Ernest Blythe was Minister for Finance. And, so the nationalists had been sloughing it off for decades, really with this optimistic perception of the prosperity that independence would bring through channels that remained unidentified. So as you know, in the 1920s, the chickens really came home to roost. And I'll talk about that just in a moment. Just let me figure out where I'm going. Okay, yeah. Okay, so I'm almost there. I'm almost finished now. So I just want to kind of re-emphasise this issue then, that in the debates over Home Rule or independence versus remaining part of the integrated fiscal entity that was the United Kingdom, the burden of the pensions loomed very, very large. That the pensions, the same rate was payable in Britain and in Ireland, and Ireland was a much poorer country. So would Ireland be able to afford to keep paying the same pension if it became independent? So you all know where that story is going when I come to the 1920s. But let me return now to a Home Rule pamphlet. And I'm saying the nationalist side in general were very optimistic that independence would bring prosperity, and everybody in this room knows that it didn't. One unusual nationalist pamphlet, though, whilst it was kind of still quite caught up in that magical thinking that the future was going to be very bright and prosperous, nevertheless recognised that there might be severe difficulties in the short term. And this is well worth listening to carefully. This is Erskine Childers' Home Rule pamphlet, I think 1910 or 1912 or something. He says, If there were no alternative between financial independence without a farthing of temporary aid and permanent financial dependence, it would pay Ireland 1,000-fold in the future to choose the former, independence, in the future. But to remodel taxation promptly to meet the initial deficit, and with equal promptitude set on foot such a drastic reduction of expenditure as would ensure the rapid attainment of a proper financial equilibrium. So we had two former finance ministers up here this morning, and of course our good chairman is former Department of Finance. They will recognise this, you know. But Childers goes on to say, when once the Irish realised the issue, they would accept the responsibility with all its attendant sacrifices, which would no doubt be severe. So that's a pretty realistic interpretation of what the burden of independence is actually going to mean. So then, just to take you up to 1924, when the government is born, the Free State is born into fiscal crisis. The year 1924, 3/4 of government revenue is used up on payment for damaged property and on army expenses. 3/4 of government revenue. Today, it'll be far less than 1%, I imagine. So 3/4 of government revenue. The government has to float a national loan. International capital markets are not going to lend it a penny unless it shows fiscal rectitude, as we call it today. So, had the Irish pension been brought down in line with Ireland's wealth relative to Britain's, that would have entailed a cut of over 50% in the pension. The Department of Finance recommended to Blythe a cut of 20%. Blythe eventually cut it by 10%. And of course, we recognise, you know, that's a major factor in their losing the 1932 general election. So Blythe, you know, that was a moderate, you know, it was catastrophic to the people who had to suffer it. But that cut of a shilling was a 10% cut. Whereas, you know, finance, who are the bad guys in every historian's books, you know, were recommending a cut of a mere 20%, whereas, you know, an objective economist would have said that thing that needs to be cut by 50 or 60%. Anyway, so unfortunately, we were born into fiscal crisis. We were born, you know, one or both of our parents were these magical thinkers, so it rapidly came home to roost. Now, my final point then is the 1918 election we know had essentially nothing to do with economics. So I've read the Sinn Féin manifesto. I've read news, which is only 2 pages. I've read excerpts of the Parliamentary Party manifesto. There was almost nothing. So the election obviously wasn't about economics. Even in Ulster, Ulster's refusal to countenance Home Rule, a leading northern businessman, they were all men, of course, at that time, and later Northern Ireland Finance Minister said the antipathy to Home Rule is more about religion than economics. And down south as well, it was about control of one's destiny rather than about economics. So what you make of that, I don't know. I'm unlike some of our earlier speakers. I'm not espousing a political position here. I'm as shocked by some of these conclusions that I'm coming to myself, as I hope at least some of you are. So, but just to point out, this same magical thinking was dominant prevailed in all the states on the eastern periphery that achieved their independence at around the same time as Ireland. It's just in the 1920s we made a hell of a better job of the bad hands that we were dealt than did any of those other states, from Finland, the Baltics, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Poland, down to Yugoslavia. We did a pretty good job in the 1920s. Okay. Thank you.
Okay, Frank, well, thank you for that. Even though the Department of Finance gets a bad press, my experience as a finance man was always, if you ask for 120%, you might get 80%. And that was always, I can say that now the ministers are not around, the ex-ministers. So there's always an element of tactical positioning in the advice that civil servants give. So don't believe everything you find in the files.